Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the CDS Lab RCN. We have our webinar on a panel where we have our experts in community engagement. Chingwen is going to be the moderator for this panel. And we have Nori to introduce all the speakers. Okay, I give the podium to you guys.
Thank you. I'm happy to introduce the panelists and our moderator for today. First, we have Dr. Michael Menser. He is an assistant professor at Brooklyn College and associate director at the Science and Resilience Institute at the Jamaica Bay. His work explores participatory democracy and ecological sustainability from a variety of levels. Then we have Dr. Erik Johnston. He's a professor at Arizona State University and the co-director of the Center for Smart Cities and Regions. His research in smart cities and regions integrates open governance and policy informatics applications of public interest technology to serve all communities, including participation from traditionally underserved populations. We have Jeffrey Raven. He's an associate professor at the New York Institute of Technology and also member of our research coordination network. His work spans on the traditional influence of architect urbanists by bridging climate science policy and design practice. We also have Dr. Margaret Hinrich. She's an assistant research professor in the School of Complex Adaptive Systems at Arizona State University. Her research has led to recommendations for harnessing the natural complexity of diverse groups of an interest for inclusive community-centered convergence research. And lastly, I will introduce our moderator, Dr. Chingwen Cheng. She's the program head and associate professor at the school at the design school in Arizona State University. Her teaching, research, and practice engage transdisciplinary approaches for climate justice design, integrating environmental justice theory, spatial mixed methods, systems design, and nature-based solutions, working with communities for co-developing research agenda and strategies to enhance community resilience and sustainability. Dr. Chen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nuri, for the very kind introduction. And welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining this fantastic panel. I'm really thrilled and honored to serve as panel moderator. We had our our panel has, is working on community engagement, but each of them really has a very unique methodology, philosophy, and how they approach the community engagement. So I will first like to invite all panelists to briefly summarize what is your philosophy and method of your approach of community engagement, and what lessons you have learned so far, and what are some limitations and future directions that you think you would like to advance of your approach. So I would like to start by inviting Dr. Johnston.
Okay, thank you very much, Chingwen. When we think about this, we think about the sort of discovery process within regions as the design of governance infrastructure. And when we talk about sort of the summary of approach, and this will take about a minute or 2 minutes, we tend to ask a question sort of, given our status, what is the best outcome that we can collectively achieve? And then how do we get there? And within this simple question sort of reveals 3 different capacities that we think about when designing these processes with different stakeholder groups. And the first of which is detection. Where do we stand? How are we doing? What is happening sort of within the space that we are? The second is deliberation. Collectively, what are the different values that need to be visible? How do they work with each other? Do they trade off? Do they complement each other? What's happening? And then the third is developing sort of discovery pathways. And within this, there's sort of a couple categories of, is there a path that can get us where we want to be that already exists? Do we collectively have to make a path and co-design sort of what is possible? And then as we're going along this path, how do we integrate sort of learning pathways into it so that we can discover what works for us versus what might work for other communities. And so our broad sort of sense is always sort of approaching problems with curiosity, bringing people together, and then focusing on detection, deliberation, discovery so that we can create more robust governance infrastructures.
Thank you. Is Dr. Margaret Heinrich, since you work with Dr. Johnston before, do you want to add on, or do you have other additional approach you have been developing?
I would say if Erik has given like the broad level approach, I would say kind of boots on the ground. We do a lot of use of data and data informatics in our interactions with communities. And we very much take an approach of working with communities, not working for communities, because we've seen a lot of researchers that try to kind of do things for communities when those communities aren't necessarily part of the creation of the research question, the creation of understanding the problem. And so we very much take an approach to having members of the community be actively involved and really intellectually invested in whatever it is we're working on, so that they feel confident that they can pick it up and go and take it and not always be reliant on us as the researchers for that process. And a big part of eliciting that kind of implicit tacit knowledge is through the use of data informatics, which I can talk more about a little later.
Yeah, very interesting. Incorporate big data. Or I'll invite Mike Menser to describe your methods and.
All right, thank you. And definitely like the previous one, really fascinated by that governance infrastructure framework. I mean, again, I'm in New York and with the Science and Resilience Institute, Jamaica Bay. I think our philosophy is sustained engagement. How do you build engagement that lasts over time, that has a cycle to it? When I come at this from the approach, I was a co-founder of something called the Participatory Budgeting Project, which is a nonprofit that helps communities get control over an actual pot of money, oftentimes within a municipal jurisdiction. And so in that project, right, there's actually resources available for the community to actually make proposals and fund projects. So that's kind of what, a high bar of engagement, right? A lot of times we think of engagement as having more of a, giving the community a voice. I really am against that idea of that engagement is primarily about giving communities voices. I think it has to be about sharing power, sharing capacities, sharing jurisdictional authority, and sharing resources. Even if they're small gains, right? They're important gains. So I think our philosophy is really sustained engagement. It's capacity building, it's relationship building, and those relationships have to be with the community-based organizations and internal to their community, with relationships with other community-based organizations, and then relationships with the relevant government agencies over time. And some of those are more difficult than others. And I think a challenge with this is when you're trying to develop the relationships, you often can make sacrifices about how many people are involved, right? When you're trying to build relationships, right? That's not massive amounts of people. So I think that's one of the tensions in our approach that I'm happy, we'll have discussion more about as we proceed.
Great, thank you. And Jeffrey?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So I approach this as from the climate resilient urban design perspective, and so one of the, I think, important sort of aspirational goals for the work that we do is to essentially build coalition and connect the dots to find sort of co-benefits across multiple sectors, and to build alliances around these sort of aspirational goals that were expressed by the community. And one way that we do that is that we have developed what we call the urban design climate workshops approach, where initially when we go and engage with community, we don't talk about climate at all, but we actually look at the kinds of issues that emerge from a workshop around community frustrations, the issues around quality of life, access to jobs, services, that sort of thing, that eventually we go through a process where we look at overlapping the climate piece, how the climate piece fits into the kinds of community priorities that were expressed through this engagement process. And so we sort of flip the script in a way where climate is this kind of abstract, difficult sometimes to get your arms around, but actually we approach it from the ground up, where the community really highlights its priorities.
Great, thank you. That actually get into an interesting contrast right now about the approaches, especially when how we communicate information and how we gather the data. So I think the next maybe conversation I would like to get into is, so from Erik and Margaret's team, you mentioned about, the IT, technology information, a little bit about big data and, for decision making, and also mostly from your case study, I reviewed it in a previous lecture, are engaged in a higher rank of decision makers. Whereas I look at, Jeffrey and Mike's case study are a little more community based and the local knowledge. So I'm curious how you all think about, what other approaches we should consider, right? How we gather this information, how we communicate, in order for the community to be well informed and also, being able to engage together to really make a decision moving toward. So, anyone wants to chime in first?
I could say, I mean, if I can jump in. One technique that we've been using are scenario models, and they're very effective in the sense that if we have a scenario of a current district in relationship, say, to density, climate impacts, we know that the districts have a particular resiliency profile that can be measured through urban heat island or flood. And overlapping with that is our identified vulnerable demographics, communities, how they use the spaces, that sort of thing. And then we project a scenario for a development of the community based on, let's say, worst case scenarios. So if the community were to fully max out its allowable development, and at the same time is subjected to major impacts of climate as it is projected based on data and evidence, then we have a sort of scenario that the community then can sort of be confronted with that sets the stage for a discussion about how we could achieve win-win opportunities for, let's call it, for the sake of argument, best practice, which is based on urban climate factors that we leverage and bring to the table. So that's one way of sort of starting that conversation around scenario modeling.
Great, thanks. Erik or Margaret want to, Margaret want to talk more about.
Sure. So I heard your question as that. So Erik and I work a little bit more with kind of like governance level decision maker policy people, and our two panelists work perhaps a little more with like local community organizations. And I would say that, so depending on our project, we work with representatives of communities and stakeholders at all different levels. So there's one of the first projects we worked on was looking at Arizona's adult post-secondary attainment rate. And our funders and collaborators in that effort were representatives from the Arizona Board of Regents, from local community colleges, from education, kind of lobbyist policy interest groups. And that was a much more kind of governance flavor because the topic under consideration was so kind of politically laden, particularly at the time in Arizona with the Red for Ed movement and a lot of other stuff that was going on. There have been other projects that I would say are much more local in nature. So Erik and I work closely with the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience here at ASU, and they've done a lot of work with local organizations that are trying to provide services for homeless people, for local Salvation Army offices that are trying to provide utility assistance so that people in Maricopa County can pay their air conditioning bills in the summer. And so these are very, very localized, contextual problems that we've used generally our same approach with, though. So this is a long way of saying that the method we use can kind of be applied to either one of these kind of levels of decision makers, I guess you could say. And so the way we've kind of positioned these is as knowledge convergence workshops. And so this word convergence is very popular at the NSF. I'm sure many of you have heard this idea of rallying intellectually diverse perspectives and kind of bringing them to bear on complex social problems. And so this idea of knowledge convergence is one that we've tried to put into practice by putting together a series of kind of best practices and strategies using data, using these collaborative kind of co-opetition environments where we use data informatics to kind of create some kind of level playing field, or at least make sure everyone is having the same conversation. Because particularly in the education project, everyone had their different silver bullet of how to magically solve Arizona's post-secondary attainment rate. And it wasn't until we actually started putting data up on the screen and having different people, having different voices make sense of what they saw on the screen and comparing those kind of contextual understandings, comparing those sense-making stories across different groups, that we began to really kind of dig into what some of the real challenges would be to even try and get everyone behind a goal like increasing Arizona's post-secondary attainment, because while it may sound great in theory, everyone's got different benefits that they might see from a goal like that.
I see. Thank you. Mike, what's your experience of what kind of data you will use, or how you gather those data through community engagement to address any issue?
I think the data that our institute's working with right now is on flooding, sunny day, rainy day, coastal event flooding. And there's two different projects that we have. One's called FloodNet, one's called FloodWatch. One has a federal partner and the other has a city partner. And I think one of the questions with that is, why does it matter to collect data on flooding? So is it for homeowners to be able to make decisions on where to park their car? Is it for the water utility and the Department of Environmental Protection to decide where to make sewage upgrades? Is it to influence the climate planning processes, of which there are too many in New York City? We get a new plan on climate every 3 months. We have way too many plans. It's not clear what they have an impact on. But I feel like a lot of data is sort of hanging out there and maybe doesn't have the specific decision tree that Margaret was mentioning, right? Where here's the problem and then there's a very specific conversation. And then there's also, of course, the question of who owns that data. But again, why do we even care? What's the data being used for? And I think that how that relates back to community stakeholders is they can feel empowered by the data to just confirm their observations or to have a better understanding of the micro effects in their neighborhoods. And then that can help them relate more to agencies and when they justify their capital requests through different processes to agencies.
Thank you. Erik?
Can I just add one thing on to that, which is We also see data as a way to encourage cooperation and coordination between the different groups. And so we'll have an intake process where we ask them, well, what data do you use and how do you use it? How do you understand success? And then as Margaret was talking about with these convergence workshops, we ask them to share the data with us that we can sort of process it, not just their own data set, but with other people's data sets to come up with a sense of how the data sort of paints a picture of the broader system. And then when they arrive at the activity, they can locate their data within the broader system that we're talking about. They see it as legitimate, accurately represented. And then they also see it in the context of how other people are thinking about the process. And so a lot of times what we're finding is most people don't take within this environment, they don't take an adversarial approach to each other, but they see themselves as being able to self-organize because they're trying to accomplish similar things that complement each other. They're trying to improve the health of the overall system that they're a part of, and their data becomes sort of their entry point to that broader conversation. And then if we can back out of the way and allow them to self-organize, then collectively they have the best understanding and insight of how do you improve the health of the use of data flood water management. And that's not our expertise, but that would be one of the types of examples of that.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, Jeffrey.
I was just going to say, if I could respond to especially Erik and Mike's point.
Mm-hmm.
I think data can just sort of sit there, and the question is, how do you ensure that the data is applied and becomes kind of an action item within policy, for example. And to Mike's point about the flooding, green infrastructure is in a sense of kind of a poster child, if you will, for cross-sectoral connecting the dots between different groups within the city who could rally around, say, data having to do with vegetative cover, for example, or the lack thereof, in relationship to flood, in relationship to heat, et cetera. So, for example, if we were to sort of connect the dots between green infrastructure and public health, green infrastructure and energy, green infrastructure and mobility, green infrastructure and job creation, and then green infrastructure and culture and community, then you really start to have a very compelling story to tell. So part of it is the weaving of a narrative around certain urban systems that are, that have data connected to them, but that actually start to lead us down a particular path towards action and resources and investment. So I can get into that more, but I was just curious what the others thought.
One of the things we've experienced a lot is making those types of connections visible and giving people power in terms of what they can control. So if you can control green infrastructure and influence that, it's amazing how you're also part of the social justice conversation, also part of the urban design conversation, also part of, over and over. When we're talking about education, education also has social justice components, health components, all these other components. And you start recognizing, if I control this one part of the system, I actually can influence all these other different areas through these pathways. And by making those connections visible, you increase the reach people recognize that they have, because they can improve the education within their local environment. That then helps with economic situations, social services, and criminal justice all at the same time.
Great. I think there's a kind of common commonality of how we collect the data, both from local knowledge and other available source, and how we can review that relationship, right, in order to inform the participants, the communities about all that relationship in order to make the best decisions. The next kind of related question would be, what would be the best strategies? I think perhaps that data integration is one of them, to really build a trusty kind of co-design process with the community. Do you have any successful stories and challenges to how we can really meaningfully engage with community and make sure that decision making really fits the communities?
So I put a link in the chat to an image and a report from a project that we recently did in collaboration with the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College here at ASU. They had received funding to host a 2-day workshop on global learning metrics. And so one of the things they wanted to do was use kind of some of our expertise and our space to explore what would it look like to quantify and have a model of global learning metrics. And so we worked with them to create kind of a straw man model. And I'm thinking, Jeffrey, about what you just said as well about integrating all of these different systems, because one of the things we did, and you can see if you click on the link, we have a multi-screen environment. And so on each screen, we connected, and this was, again, a straw man hypothetical, like future fantasy model. What would it look like to measure global learning metrics against economic indicators? What would it look like to measure global learning metrics against environmental indicators? What would it look like to measure them against things like quality of life or happiness or representation of certain people in government or even economic or educational outcomes in those different countries? And okay, now let's compare what that looks like in Brazil versus China, or in Canada versus Egypt, or just being able to kind of have some of these conversations and kind of complicate this conversation a little bit, but using a technique that Erik has found from computational photography called focus stacking. So it's this idea of bringing multiple different elements of a picture into focus and kind of stacking them on top of each other to create a high resolution image. And this is kind of our ethos behind pulling in many different social systems when we're looking at something like education or something like urban flooding or something like global learning metrics, to really have a more kind of high resolution conversation around the multiple different social systems that are affected by a common problem. And so in this particular instance, we had policymakers, stakeholders, people in education from all over the world in a room to basically pick apart this straw man model that we had created. And again, this process of it really revealed biases, it revealed implicit knowledge, it revealed kind of taken for granted perspectives that they didn't maybe realize they had until they started critiquing what was on the screen. And so all of these different kind of perspectives and this feedback was collected, and the faculty are using it to kind of disseminate a report and hopefully put forth a more comprehensive proposal to dive into global learning metrics a little more. So this is kind of one example, and to give you a visual of what one of our convergence workshops would look like in practice.
An impressive screen you've got there.
So I can see, yeah, you have really sophisticated kind of technology wise, right? How we synthesize those data and visualize it. But I'm curious about the process of how we really engage the community in a meaningful way in terms of how people can build that trust, why they trusted our data, and how we present it, and how can we really co-design with the community.
I want to add something to what Margaret said, because the framing of that question suggests that we are the ones that have the knowledge, and that we're trying to build up the trust that we will tell them what the answers are. And we have found that that sort of mindset fails over and over again. In the early sort of versions of the decision theater, we tried to create these beautiful models that would explain sort of how to deal with water scarcity and all sorts of drought conditions. And then people looked at it, they were impressed, and then they went about their own day. What we found was that we had to sort of engineer an environment that allowed for people to discover for themselves the types of connections or the types of insights that they could use to improve the way that they wanted to navigate the systems that they were part of. And so we called this the Trojan horse approach, where we brought them into an environment like the one Margaret just linked to, And we created a bunch of opportunities either through scenarios or through questioning that treated them like the experts, that created the conditions for them to discover things. Because if you're the one that discovers a truth or discovers an insight, you're far more likely to act on it than if we claim to be the ones that sort of own the knowledge and are trying to convince you of the insight that we had discovered.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a slightly different question than the trust, but the trust question is about sort of, do you trust the process? Do you think it's authentic? Do you trust sort of what has been discovered? And are you willing to continue collaborating with the other people within the group? And are you willing to put your resources, your energy, your attention at risk for the collective challenge or the collective process? And the one thing I'll mention on that is we actually did test out a bunch of different scenarios of people playing social goods games after they participate in the decision theater.
Mm-hmm.
And if they collaboratively came up with a solution where everyone thought that they had an authentic voice, they were far more likely to share resources and to trust each other than if they were trying to solve the same type of problem on individual laptops in the same room. The sort of community aspect of co-discovery, the shared language of it being a common problem that affected all of them and that they were a part of, led to the likelihood that they were going to collaborate and put their resources at risk. So we also tested those elements of why does it matter that we're participating in a decision theater type space? How do we build up trust within this environment?
Thank you for that note. Mike, do you have any, from your experience, how do you build that process?
Yeah, I would say that it's through identifying community leaders in the jurisdiction that you're operating in, and then having one-on-ones or small group meetings with them over time and meeting with them on their turf, and then attending meetings that they want you to attend. And that's kind of a slow process. It's very different under COVID because to do that remote was both easier and sort of more tenuous. But and that's usually the way we proceed with our community engagement around Jamaica Bay. And then out of that, those relationships, then you bring in the communities that they're leaders of or the other folks that they work with. And then you have to negotiate, interpolitical rivalries in communities, right? Because that happens a lot too. I think one of the limits of that approach, that is a trust enhancing approach, and we've had long, multi-year relationships with communities now because of that. And they come back to us, and then we also bring researchers to them, which I hope is something we can talk about. How do we make research available to communities, or are people's research just not? That's not the point of it. And then what is the point? Is it policy or education or something else? But I think again, the limits of that model is, you're not necessarily reaching parts of communities that haven't been reached. Community leaders have their own biases and their own limitations. So at a certain point, you have to raise that, and depending on the capacity of an organization, they can take that on or not. So some communities we work with were able to take that on and recognize that they need to bring in more members of different social subgroups. And then other communities just didn't have the capacity for that. So there's just a more long-term capacity building process that has to happen before you can get to that next phase. And I think, it kind of goes back to the data thing too. Again, and maybe it varies by subject, like data and air quality might have a higher efficacy than data and flooding. New York City, there's more and more data on flooding, and the city's, its new waterfront plan is to have more development on the waterfront. So, and yeah, there's definitely a need for a different narrative and a different flow of capital, and then there's the multi-agency, cooperation problem. But I think on the trust side, again, it's that sustained engagement, which is relationship building. And this time, a lot of times between the community and key agency officials or key department officials that they need to cultivate relationships, not just the internal ones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This idea or this question of what does the process look like is one that we've focused on a lot in our recent work, and specifically in collaborations with the Knowledge Exchange. I put a link in the chat of a recent playbook that we put together of our kind of lessons learned and some best practices. And some of them do focus more on kind of the front end of what does it mean to identify critical community partners? What makes a community partner critical? What does it mean to grow a stakeholder network? How do you manage the inclusion process? And so we've kind of compiled a lot of these into a playbook that is a living document. And so this is also just an invitation to anyone, if you have other kind of what we call plays or tools or strategies that you've used, we would love to hear from you and include them in future iterations. But this is kind of our first stab at trying to get a handle on what does it actually look like in practice to do some of this, and what are some strategies.
Great. This is a very good effort to collect this. Yes. And
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just in my world, with respect to the work on climate, for example, sort of out, you know, the incorporation of community in the actual designing process is really interesting. And we look to do more of that, you know, in the future. But the role of community expert, and that we're essentially coming in as technical and scientific experts who advise and assist the community, is very important. But you know, one of the, if you look at sort of the technical steps of what we work on, when we are going through a process of climate analysis mapping, for example, that sort of identifies urban and local priorities, and not only around sort of hotspots of where public health is the most, you know, critical, and a kind of vulnerable neighborhood, vulnerable community, et cetera. But who lives there? How do they use the space? The relationship between that and poverty, health outcomes, transit deserts, you know, those become very interesting opportunities to engage the community, for them to actually get involved in the mapping out of these priority areas. And when we get into public space evaluation, we're really interested in issues around comfort, physiological comfort. And so using sensors, for example, the community could can be engaged in the data collection at different times of days, different generations. It could be teenagers, it could be grandparents, and that sort of will help develop a kind of hierarchy of climate priorities through this kind of intergenerational ownership over the process of data gathering. So I think that that's really an exciting area that you know, offers a lot of opportunity for engaging community in the process.
Thank you. I think what I'm hearing commonly maybe is that ownership and kind of how let the community discover that issues while we as scientists and experts may help to put that data together and help them to review that relationship, but they will be the one to discover and make it forward. So I think this sounds like a common strategy. We have audience. Cecilio, you have questions, comments?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I want to apologize. I couldn't get away from our meeting early enough to join you. I'm here in representation of my dean, Walter Diaz, from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And I find the discussion fascinating. Personally, my perspective, or my world, as the colleague mentioned right now, is the world of a Puerto Rican researcher that was impacted by Hurricane Maria 5 years ago. And I wanted to share the feelings of community engagement when you, as an academic related to your community, are him or herself impacted by a major event. And many times, and it was our experience, I would say many members of academia in Puerto Rico, we we were put in a position to be able to observe the observer, and which was really telling in looking at colleagues from mainland universities. I'm going to use the term, but really parachute in right after the event and try to do community engagement like on the fly, sometimes by identifying contacts in the internet even, and just to follow, the trend of rapid research grants that NSF established for that type of event. And as I'm hearing, the more reflexive planning and bringing the community in, I just wanted to mention that sometimes we are the ones that follow the community, and most of the time, as it was during Maria, the community were really aware of the main issues and the priority of those issues were at that time. They did not need for any planning to be for them to be engaged in the planning of perhaps establish a hierarchy of what those were. And I approached these things since then with an enormous amount of humility. When I established this new architecture of relationships where a lot of times I am the follower of the community's knowledge and the community's processes that already exist many times. So I just wanted to say thanks for allowing me to engage in this conversation. I know a lot of some of the colleagues at ASU. I continue to do work with folks like Clark Miller on energy transitions work back in the island. And we have developed this a much better understanding of engagement as a concept. And many times is a concept that makes you the follower and the learner. Other than the coordinator and the establisher of agendas for action. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks for allowing me to communicate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that really brought a very critical point of ethics, perhaps if we can frame it, is because the community exists and they have their own way, about how they communicate with their own members, and that we, as experts, as scientists, sometimes think we create, the structure, and I think it's important to be aware that we don't actually kind of perpetuate that type of kind of colonialized kind of ideal of how we impose the systems, into the indigenous already local system. So I guess it's important to understand deeply in the community first before we attempt to engage. But and there's sometimes when we are invited to the community that's have a, that usually make us a little bit more opportunity to say how we can help to try to propose different approaches. But I think we as scientists probably first should acknowledge what is existing in place. So we have about 10 minutes left, so I would like to open up for the audience for more questions.
We have one question. Thank you. We have one question from Michael Babker.
Thank you for recognizing me. I heard early on, kind of a distinction between, searching for knowledge, for voices, and searching for power for application of resources. And I'm wondering how we balance those two things. I know they're not mutually exclusive, but how we balance in the process, especially over time, as we try to maintain community engagement over, having concrete goals and things that are achieved in terms of gaining resources for communities as a way to maintain the process, and how we track that as success of the project.
Good question, good point.
Well, I mean,
guess
yeah, it's a really good question. The thing is that in the world of urban development, especially, and initiatives that the cities are trying to kind of put forward, or communities are trying to put forward, oftentimes we're not existing in our own researcher world. We are engaging with practitioners, with people who are being paid by the client to put together a project. And to Michael's question, in terms of power and knowledge gathering, oftentimes the practice community is a service community. It's a service industry. So the architect, the urban planner, et cetera, is constrained to a certain degree, not completely, but to a certain degree, by the client's framework to a certain degree. Now they could push back, they could be advocates, they can push the envelope. But I know from personal experience, because I come out of that world, that, and especially we're talking about the United States now to a large degree, but when you start doing international projects as well, it gets really complicated with respect to the relationship to power and to who can frame the development agenda, and it's a very, very tricky conversation. But I'm glad you raised it, because it's an excellent topic.
We had a little bit of an example with that, with a project that we worked on about a year or two ago at this point, with a local school district who had signed a data sharing agreement with us to share student level data to understand student outcomes and teacher performance. And in order to get the buy-in for that data sharing agreement, our primary collaborators were the principals, vice principals, and some district level administrators. And so they were the main people that we worked with through the first couple kind of data convergence workshops to understand what we were seeing in the data. But what we as the research team acknowledged moving forward was that there were no teachers in the room. The room was pretty homogenous in terms of various kinds of representation. And so had we continued to move forward, and then COVID happened and funding issues happened, and we kind of, we didn't get to move on with the next season of that project as we hoped, but we knew we had kind of internally committed that if this project moves forward, we need to have the teachers in the room. We need to have other kind of people who experience what we're seeing in the data every day in the room, besides just these kind of people who are in higher positions of power.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just jump in, Cecilia, before, so I think that, and Cecilia, you might be very strong in this particular point, which is that, to me, process is the zone between power and sort of urban project, let's say. So process is the question. It's the big question, and oftentimes that process is shaped by powerful forces. But go ahead, sorry, Cecilio.
No. you're absolutely right. And those processes, let me give an example. Looking at the power relationships of an outside entity, whether it's a university or whether it is a federal agency like FEMA that's coming in, there's an enormous amount of manufactured ignorance. There's an enormous amount of asymmetries, colonial relations that, I mean, the university doesn't have, the agency doesn't have, and all they have is a number of contacts that were made, prearranged contacts, so that things would flow and function as the intervention and the encounter occurs. This is very colonial, but the fact is, if we would be able to develop research agendas around those processes, and the pre-establishment of relationships, not as projects, but as processes themselves. If we put a date and an end date on these things, they become projects. Communities are smarter than that, and they was before. If they detect that a process of engagement has clicked, and we can identify those gaps in power understanding, those gaps in what areas of manufactured ignorance. For example, in Puerto Rico, there was a lot of manufactured ignorance around corruption practices, and counters that were made. If they're not informed on that topic, from the local community level to the state government level, the interventions were doomed for failure as it is. And the example of the energy transition of Puerto Rico, I think it's a good example, because 5 years after the event, we still see the need for a better understanding, not only of the technical aspects of energy, but the government thing, the whole thing, the thing. So I'm sorry.
Thank you. I think that's a very critical point. It also kind of aligns with my current research agenda on really looking at what is design justice, and that justice is the system. So how do we understand the system? How can we perhaps when we try to engage with community to understand that power structure and how the system is constructed, and then what would be the ways to intervene, advocate, or really make transformative change? And that would be I think probably align with the recent, I think common agenda on how we can achieve a more justice, equity, diversity, inclusion goals, and for all the projects we are doing, all the research we are doing. So for the last maybe 3 minutes of, if the panelists want to conclude or bring your one kind of last insights about how we can innovate our approach to achieve justice goals.
Well, I can maybe just, I think a planning process, a plot process, again, we said sort of between power and, let's say, project, there's sort of this process. It's a fluid negotiation between different groups, and the process itself can unleash powerful forces that are sometimes beyond the control of the very group that is initiating the effort. So we don't, depending on the process, it can actually take on a life of its own. And I've experienced that on certain projects. So, for example, with the evolution of participatory democracy, community-based planning does offer an incentive for activism and gives citizens the opportunity to participate in the formation of policy. But that's a risk by the powerful, the power structure. That's a risk. So that's all I want to say, but it's a really, compelling question.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, from our perspective, the sustained engagement, right? How do you get resources that are available to communities that need them, that have been screwed over, marginalized, attacked, displaced? And it helps them to build out their infrastructure over time. And again, not just their internal infrastructure, but their relationships with key actors in whatever their domain is. And the energy, Cecilia brought up the energy situation in Puerto Rico is one whole huge story of failures on that level. And then a moment right now. But there's re-articulations. I don't know if people work in energy, but the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, it just created an office of engagement. And so that's very interesting because this is, FERC has its whole thing about, how it operates. So, but I think energy is one area where you're really seeing now fights and changes happen between the federal and state level, which has huge implications on the local level, huge. The meeting I had before today was helping an environmental justice cooperative solar firm be able to apply for an energy grant. And FERC changed the whole process. So it's a lot easier for them to apply for hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's a big deal, right? That's a big deal. And that's a process point. So I think, and this is going back to Jeffrey's point, right? Because, it's multi-scalar processes. We're in a very multi-scalar moment, and that makes it hard in certain ways, but it also makes maybe more resources available to our partners in ways. And then we that are in these institutions have to help them navigate them, right? There has to be an obligation that we have to help them navigate that, I think.
Thank you. Margaret?
In the interest of time, I'll just say, keep sharing your failures because everybody can. So please keep sharing your failures.
Thank you, guys. Erik.
The final thought I have is that as smart cities is dependent on community engagement, we need to make a conscious investment in the ethics and practices that we engage in, because the technology will always outpace sort of the best ways to approach these situations. I put a bunch of links into the chat that talk about sort of the ethical considerations for both researchers, as well as how do you prepare and empower the community to choose what they want to participate in, to choose how they want to explore sort of better futures for themselves. And so it should be a parallel conversation that's taking place.
Great, thank you. Thank you all very much for your time and the panelists. I'm going to give the floor back to Cecilia.
Thank you all for the wonderful discussion. We will be making this recording available, and I encourage everybody to connect offline and make your discussion continuously in our social media or linked in other sites. We're also thinking about an in-person meeting anytime soon, so I'll keep everybody posted if this happens. Thank you very much and have a wonderful Friday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for a really interesting discussion.
Yes, very much. Thanks.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining.